Have you ever stopped to think about how many stories have been buried over time, and how many are still waiting to be heard? What if one of those stories was about someone who gave everything for his nation, but was forgotten for almost 60 years? For decades, she was just a faceless name, a forgotten presence amid old archives and dusty memories of war. Reba Caroline Bailey, a name lost to time. A woman who served, fought, and disappeared, until in 2025, nearly 60 years after her death, the truth finally emerged from the shadows. Reba passed away in 2015 in complete anonymity. No one knew who she was, where she came from, or what she had done. But the reality was much bigger, much deeper. She was a war veteran. Someone who, in silence, carried with her the trauma, the weight and the honor of a generation that fought for freedom. Now, for the first time, her identity has been restored. A military funeral worthy of the woman she was has finally been granted. But what happened all these years? Why did no one know her true story? And what does this tell us about the forgotten people of war? This is a dive into a historical mystery. A vivid portrait of loss, memory, and redemption, an invitation to hear the voice of those who could not speak for themselves. If you stick around until the end, you'll understand how a forgotten name became a symbol of restored honor, and why this story can change the way you see the silent heroes who walk among us. Get ready for a real, moving, and unforgettable journey. Because some stories, even if buried for decades, deserve to be heard. In a quiet corner of a healthcare facility in Oklahoma in 2015, an elderly woman died with no one by her side. Without valid documents, without a reliable medical history, without any known relatives, she entered anonymously and thus left life, shrouded in silence. Reba Caroline Bailey, or at least that was the name registered on the file. But there, at that moment, no one knew for sure if that was her real name or just another loose fragment of a forgotten life. Her body was cremated, her belongings stored in a warehouse that would soon be emptied. No relatives appeared, no friends, nothing. Just a life ended and archived like so many others that disappear into the anonymity of the country's bureaucratic systems. But what no one knew, and what is only now beginning to emerge, is that this woman had been a war veteran, a member of the United States Armed Forces, one of the few women of her generation to wear a uniform and serve courageously in times of conflict and global tension. She was part of a historical machine that shaped the contours of the 20th century. And yet, she had been forgotten. How is it possible that someone who served the country disappears without a trace, without recognition, without even a tombstone with her name on it? The answer lies in human failures, in the slowness of systems, and above all, in the way society deals with its veterans, especially those who have no family or whose mental and emotional health has been devastated by the horrors of war. Reba's story begins to unfold not through a major criminal investigation or a public scandal, but through a silent database, the Department of Defense's Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Years after her death, a nationwide project of cross-referencing military records, old hospital records, and veterans' files began to bear fruit. DNA samples collected from archived remains were analyzed and compared with family information provided by distant relatives of missing soldiers. And it was in one of those cross-referencings that the name Reba Caroline Bailey came back to life. The Department of Veterans Affairs made a clear identification. The woman who had died in oblivion in 2015 was one of the many veterans who disappeared after their military service. Her records, for some reason that is still not fully understood, had been lost between one base transfer and another, between a military hospital and a state psychiatric institution. Upon leaving the military, like many of her colleagues, she faced difficulties in reintegrating into society. The traumas of service, the ghosts of war, and the lack of support networks pushed her to the margins of society. For decades, she lived under different names in small towns and sometimes in public shelters. Each time a record was created, the previous one disappeared, and so her identity was diluted until it became almost unrecognizable. And here's the heartbreaking part. Reba wasn't alone. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of similar cases, veterans who gave their all and, when they needed help most, were forgotten. But Reba's case has resurfaced, and with it, a light has been turned on. Not just to right a historical wrong, but to raise an uncomfortable question. How many silent heroes are still lost among us? The impact of this discovery was immediate. Veterans organizations, active duty military personnel, civilians, and even local authorities rallied. Reba's body, cremated and stored for years, would now receive a proper military funeral. A symbolic casket, a carefully folded flag, an honor guard saluting, and most of all, the recognition of a nation that finally said, "We remember you." Reba's story is both a wound and a healing. It is a warning and also a tribute. It is the embodiment of the truth that no life dedicated to the country should disappear without a name, without a face, without honor. And as her records were reconstructed, stories from base colleagues, battalion documents, and even letters that had been lost and now found in digitized military archives emerged. She was known for her discipline, for her silent courage, for her firm stance even in the face of fear. She was one among many, but her story now echoes as a symbol. The discovery of Reba Caroline Bailey's identity is not just a story of a solved investigation. It is a vivid reminder that behind every unidentified file, behind every number in forgotten files, there is a human story, a soul, a heart that beat for this country. And now more than ever, it is time to bring them to light. Reba Caroline Bailey's story, while unique in its details, is a painful mirror of a much larger reality. She represents an entire generation of American soldiers, men and women, who returned from war not to applause, but to oblivion. And most disturbingly, this is not a failure of one system alone. It is a collective failure of a nation that too often forgets those who fought for it as soon as the shooting stops. Wars end in the history books, but they live on in the minds and bodies of those who fought them. During the post-war decades, especially after World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, hundreds of thousands of veterans returned to the United States bearing not only visible scars, but also deep psychological trauma. Many were unable to fully reintegrate into civilian life, lacking adequate medical support, fragmented government policies, and few community support networks. They spiraled into poverty, addiction, mental illness, and abandonment. It is in this scenario that Reba's figure becomes emblematic. While many remember heroes in uniforms with parades and medals, few know of the daily battles fought by these same heroes in the dark alleys of big cities, in the cold corridors of psychiatric hospitals, or in shelters where the silence was more deafening than the explosions of war. They carried the honor, but also the weight of neglect. In the 1970s, the number of homeless veterans in the United States reached alarming proportions. Estimates indicated that almost a third of the homeless population were veterans. What is most striking is that many of these cases could have been avoided with a minimum of care, with effective public policies, with accessible support centers, and with the simple gesture of listening and welcoming. But instead, they were left to wander like living ghosts, shadows of an unfulfilled promise. Reba Caroline Bailey lived in this vacuum. When she left the military, the system should have supported her. She should have been guided, supported, included. But like so many other female veterans, who at the time faced even more prejudice and invisibility, Reba became just another number in a long statistic of social disappearances. The fact that she was a woman made her situation even worse. Even today, female veterans face greater difficulties in obtaining recognition and adequate treatment. In past decades, the stigma was even more cruel. The role of women in the military was minimized, if not ignored, and for many, like Reba, the only way out was anonymity, escape, isolation. This disconnect between service and recognition has created a gaping wound in the American national identity. How can a country claim to be the land of the brave if it allows its brave men to die alone, nameless and unremembered? The answer lies not just in public policy, but in the collective conscience. Honoring a veteran is not just about hanging a flag on Independence Day or posting tributes on social media. It means ensuring that no veteran is left behind, that their voices are heard, that their grief is treated with dignity. Fortunately, in recent years, a quiet transformation has been taking place. Thanks to advances in genetic identification technology, the emergence of organizations dedicated to recovering the memories of forgotten veterans, and the efforts of volunteers passionate about the truth, stories like Reba's are being brought to light. Databases are being cross-referenced, records are being digitized, and the loose ends of the past are finally being tied up. And perhaps most importantly, society is beginning to look again at these unseen heroes. Reba's case has reignited the debate. Newspaper articles, discussions on radio shows and social media, and even statements by authorities have highlighted the urgent need for change. And most impressively, families who had been searching for missing loved ones for decades have begun to find answers. Each name revealed, each story reconstructed, each delayed funeral is an act of national redemption. It is not just about making amends for the past. It is about affirming through actions that these lives mattered, that the silence imposed by neglect will be broken, that memory will be preserved, and that, even after 60 years, justice can be done. Reba Carolyn Bailey did not live to see this recognition, but her story now echoes as a wake-up call, a call to conscience, a reminder that every veteran man or woman deserves to be remembered not only for the war they fought, but for the life they lived. And above all, that the country can never forget those who served it with honor, even when the world has chosen to forget them. Truth, when lost, leaves traces. Even when documents are misplaced, memories fade, and names disappear, history insists on surviving in the most unlikely corners, and it was precisely this persistence of truth that rekindled the story of Reba Caroline Bailey. Because finding the identity of a veteran missing for more than half a century was not a miracle. It was the result of a patient, tireless search, driven by fragments and fueled by a greater purpose, to restore the names of those who were silenced. It all started with a database, one of many that operate behind the scenes in the American military. But this time, the work was anything but routine. This was a national effort that cross-referenced old missing persons records, medical reports, and even documents from decommissioned psychiatric hospitals with the latest genetic mapping technology. It was an ambitious project, part forensic investigation, part humanitarian mission that aimed, among other things, to name the remains of forgotten veterans. It was amid this sea of information that the first clues emerged as to who Reba might have been. A genetic profile collected from personal items kept in storage since 2015, a hairbrush, a scarf with preserved threads, began to match DNA samples from relatives registered in the Department of Defense system. The cross-referencing was slow but accurate. The chances of error were minimal. Each match was a step closer to the truth. But even with the genetic confirmation, there was still much to be clarified. Who was Reba? Where did she serve? How did her identity get lost? The answers were not all in one place. It was necessary to reconstruct a historical patchwork. Administrative reports from the armed forces from the 1960s, lists of female detachments during the Cold War, undigitized hospital transfers, correspondence archived in cardboard boxes forgotten in the basements of federal institutions. Each document contained a piece, a clue, A sign. The research team, comprised of retired military personnel, volunteers and genealogy experts, dug deep into archives dating back nearly 70 years. Amid stamps, index cards and handwritten records, they found the first official document with Reba Caroline Bailey's full name linked to a military serial number. She had been stationed at Fort McClellan, Alabama, an intensive training facility for military women in the 1950s and 60s. There, she received training in logistics, field nursing and communications operations, critical roles during the Cold War era, but rarely acknowledged by the public. From that point on, the investigation took shape. It was discovered that Reba had served in support units at bases in West Germany, helping behind the scenes during one of the most tense periods in modern history, the height of the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. She was part of the silent machinery that kept the American military infrastructure functioning outside of the country. Her records indicated exemplary behavior, impeccable conduct, and praise from superiors. But confidential medical reports also began to emerge. Symptoms of extreme stress, episodes of anxiety, notices of psychological re-evaluation. At the time, PTSD was not widely discussed, especially when it came to women. Many of these cases were simply ignored or, worse, treated as emotional instability. Reba was apparently diagnosed with chronic nervous fatigue, a common and vague term used to disguise the real impact of war on soldiers' psyches. As her mental health deteriorated, she was transferred to a psychiatric facility in Washington. Soon after, she lost contact with military command. Her family was not officially notified of her discharge, and they had moved out of state and lost all formal contact. Reba disappeared from the map, not by choice, but by systemic failures, by institutional neglect, by a society unprepared to deal with the invisible effects of war. Decades passed. The institutions that had served her were closed. The files were disorganized. Reba's name became increasingly a shadow. When she died in 2015, she was using her original name, but no one connected that name to the military past that had been erased from public records. And yet the truth survived. The papers, the objects, the DNA, all of it cried out for reconnection, as if history, even when stifled, had somehow found its way to the surface. And when the team finally put the last pieces of the puzzle together, a wave of respectful silence swept through the room. They knew what they had done. They had given voice to someone history had tried to silence. This reconstruction was not just a piece of research. It was a rescue of dignity. A declaration that no matter how much systems fail, no matter how many names are lost, the truth does not die when there are those willing to dig for it. Today, Reba Caroline Bailey's archives have been restored, digitized, and incorporated into the National Memorial to the Unknown Veterans. Her story has become a symbol of a larger movement, one of remembering, recognizing, and honoring all those who, like her, have been forgotten. On the grey morning of May 17, 2025, a reverent silence fell over Arlington National Cemetery. It was not a holiday, nor an official day of national mourning, but at that moment, hundreds of eyes turned to a symbolic casket draped in the American flag. There lay not just a body, there lay a story brought to life, a life that had been forgotten for decades, but now, before the nation, was receiving the honor it always deserved. Her name echoed solemnly over the loudspeakers, Reba Caroline Bailey. Reba's military funeral was not just a symbolic gesture, it was a reckoning with history. When the Department of Veterans Affairs officially confirmed her identity, a wave of action quickly took shape. Veterans organizations, service members, civilian volunteers, and even strangers who had followed her story on social media all stepped up to the plate. There would be no more silence. Reba would receive a tribute worthy of her service, even if it was a belated one. For the first time in nearly 60 years, someone would speak up and say, "You matter." The ceremony was simple, but emotionally charged. An honor guard of active duty and veterans marched in perfect line, their footsteps echoing on the cold floor like a beat of memory. The call for silence, that piercing trumpet blast that seemed to suspend time, pierced the air and brought tears to many eyes. There were those in attendance who had never met Reba in life, but who felt they were there for something much greater, for all the Rebas the world has forgotten. The flag, folded into a perfect triangle, was delivered to a woman who claimed to be Reba's great-niece, who had been traced through a genealogical cross-reference. Upon receiving it, she whispered, barely audible, "You have come home." And indeed, that was what the moment represented. A return. Not physical, but symbolic. A soul that had been torn from history by institutional and social neglect finally found rest and recognition. In addition to the ceremony at Arlington, there were parallel tributes in cities across the country. Some military bases held moments of silence. Public schools read her story in class, and Reba's name was inscribed on a memorial plaque dedicated to unidentified veterans. The repercussions were nationwide. Television networks reported on it. Articles were published. And most importantly, thousands of people wrote messages of thanks on social media. Ordinary people said, "I didn't know you, but thank you for your service." Reba's funeral became a symbol of something much greater than an individual tribute. It was a living denunciation of oblivion, a proof that even when all seems lost, dignity can be restored, a reminder that it is never too late to do the right thing. Because although time erases faces, the truth endures. And when it resurfaces, it demands that justice be done, even in silence, even in ashes. The impact of the case was so great that Congress proposed a resolution in Reba Caroline Bailey's name, officially recognizing her contribution to the armed forces and highlighting the importance of accelerating the process of identifying and supporting missing veterans. For the first time, Reba's name entered the annals of history as a symbol of all those who served and were not remembered. During the funeral, one of the most moving speeches was given by a retired Air Force major who tearfully declared, "Reba was one of us, one of the first, a trailblazer who paved the way for women like me to be here today. Her story did not end with silence. It began again with justice." These words touched everyone present deeply. What's more, they echoed as a call for society to take a closer look at its living veterans. How many are on the margins right now? How many live in shelters, ignored, slowly losing their identity? Reba's story has awakened this question in many hearts. Reba Caroline Bailey's legacy is now immortalized, not only in restored records, but in a generation that has learned to value what truly matters: memory, truth, and honor. Her story inspires schools to teach about the wrongs of the past, inspires lawmakers to seek solutions for those forgotten by war, and inspires families to never give up searching for their lost loved ones. Perhaps Reba never imagined, in her days of service, that she would be remembered this way. Perhaps she believed in her later years that her name had disappeared forever. But the truth is that time has not been able to erase the significance of what she did. Her sacrifice was silent, her pain was hidden, but her redemption was public and profound. The ceremony ended with a moment of collective silence, and in that moment, as the breeze gently blew across the lined gravestones, many felt that something had been healed, not just for Reba, but for an entire nation. Because to acknowledge the past is also to liberate the present. For too long, the official narrative of wars and military exploits has been written in male names. Men in trenches, generals on maps, soldiers on the march. The heroism, sacrifice, and glory were largely attributed to them, and not for lack of female participation, but because of historical omission. Women have always been there, serving, caring, operating, resisting, but many, like Reba Caroline Bailey, did so in silence. And in the end, they were tragically silenced by oblivion. Reba's service came at a time when women's roles in the military were still dubious. She served during the Cold War, when the United States was ramping up its presence on bases around the world. Reba and other women of her generation were not on the front lines with rifles in their hands, but they were in the critical backrooms of the war, in hospitals, communications centers, logistics, transportation, intelligence. They were essential, yet invisible cogs in the machine. At Fort McClellan, where Reba was trained, thousands of women underwent intense and demanding training. They were trained to deal with crises, cope with pressure, endure hostile environments, and perform their assigned duties with excellence. And they did. What they did not receive, however, was equal recognition. Their stories were often dismissed. Their emotional difficulties were treated as feminine fragility, and their legacies were often filed away in folders that no one else opened. This neglect was not accidental. It was structural. The military itself was slow to recognize the real impact that war had on women. For decades, there were no effective protocols for welcoming women after their service. Psychological support was virtually non-existent. Many who returned home found doors closed, opportunities denied, and a society that had little understanding of their experiences. What do you do with a female veteran scarred by war? How do you welcome her? How do you listen to her? In Reba's case, this neglect was devastating. Her medical records show that she began showing severe signs of anxiety and stress shortly after her deployment overseas. The military, which was supposed to protect her, discarded her, and the civilian world, which was supposed to reintegrate her, ignored her. With no support networks, no guidance, she slipped into oblivion, a lone veteran among millions, a warrior without medals, without statues, without stories, until now. Reba's silent tragedy highlights the reality for so many other women who served, while official figures now show progress. With more than 2 million women serving since World War II, the statistics of suffering are still alarming. Women veterans are more likely to develop depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and even face housing difficulties than their male counterparts. And most heartbreakingly, they are more likely to be disbelieved when they report service-related trauma. This invisibility is reinforced in popular culture, in public tributes, in school textbooks. How many girls in America grow up hearing about female war heroes? How many know the names of those who came before them, who paved the way, challenged the system and paid a high price for it? Reba's case offers a turning point. It forces us to ask hard questions and to retell the stories of war from a new perspective. Since her name was restored, an organic movement has emerged. Professors requesting materials about women veterans, documentary filmmakers beginning research, public institutions adding women's names to war memorials. For the first time in years, the lens of history is being adjusted to include those who had previously been left out of focus. More than a symbolic reparation, this turnaround represents historical justice. It is the recognition that women like Reba not only served, but also suffered and resisted, that they were fundamental pieces in the defense of the country, and that they deserve, yes, to be in the books, in the memorials, and in the hearts of Americans. The American military memory will only be complete when it includes all of their voices, including those that were silenced. Each generation needs to look back and see these women with the right eyes. Not as secondary figures, not as supporting characters, but as protagonists of a long, arduous, and deeply human story, because their silence was not due to a lack of courage, but a lack of listening. And now that we have listened, we can no longer ignore it. Reba Caroline Bailey's legacy has been restored, but more than that, it has been multiplied. Her story now serves as a tool for change. She inspires other veterans to speak out, other families to search for lost loved ones, other researchers to dig deep into the dusty archives. Because if a story like Reba's was forgotten, how many more are still untold? To honor Reba is, above all, to resolve that no other female veteran will end her days in anonymity. It is to ensure that the doors that opened with her redemption remain wide open for generations to come. It is to proclaim that their service, their pain, and their sacrifice will no longer be ignored. The story of Reba Caroline Bailey does not end with a dignified funeral, nor with the restoration of a lost name. It continues, echoing in the consciences, in the homes, in the hallways of institutions, and in the conversations of those who dare to remember. Because what has been revealed about Reba concerns not only what happened to her, but what still happens to so many. Her case is both a mirror and a warning. It is a resurrected voice that asks firmly, what about the others? How many people today live in the same silence that enveloped Reba for so many years? How many veterans walk the streets of big American cities with blank stares, carrying memories that no one wants to hear? How many women who served their country face alone battles even harder than those they were trained for? Reba's story forces us to look, really, at those who are by our side, but invisible. It invites us to leave the comfort of empty tributes and enter the sacred ground of responsibility. In the United States, more than 30,000 veterans are currently homeless, a number that screams and shames, and this number hides faces, stories, and traumas. Each one of them is a universe of pain, of effort, of promises made to the flag that are still waiting to be fulfilled. Most of them do not ask for statues. They do not want fame. They want to be heard. They want dignity. They want to be remembered before it is too late. Reba represents all of them. Her story was rescued in time. But how many other names will be lost tomorrow if we do not change anything today? The transformation that this narrative demands is not just institutional. It begins in the heart of every citizen. It begins when we decide to listen more carefully, when we stop looking at veterans as abstract symbols of patriotism and start seeing them as people, human, fragile, real. People who felt fear, who bled, who survived, and yet they are often left behind. Reba's story should move us to action, to pressure our representatives to ensure policies that provide continued assistance to veterans, to support organizations that work on reintegration, to reach out to those who have been forgotten, to remember day after day that time does not erase the value of a life served with honor. Because there is only one thing more cruel than war, forgetting those who fought for us. There is also a spiritual dimension to this journey. Reba's rescue is, in a sense, a wake-up call to the nation's moral conscience, a reminder that justice has no expiration date. It may take a long time, sometimes for decades, but when it arrives, it demands a new position. And this position involves everyone: teachers who can teach the full story, journalists who can tell the stories that have been silenced, students who can research, question, and remember, families who can recognize veterans around them, citizens who can take action. Reba's echo reaches us in a time of polarization, of constant noise, of incessant distractions. Her story forces us to slow down, to look at the essential, to recover the sense of true gratitude, and not just the passive gratitude that expresses itself in a "thank you for your service," but the gratitude that translates into justice, into care, into historical reconciliation. Because while the American flag flies with pride, it also bears the scars of those who defended it in silence. On the battlefield, Reba was trained to serve. In civilian life, she was left to fend for herself. But now, in 2025, her story stands as an invisible monument that speaks louder than any speech. No one who serves their country should die forgotten. No woman who wears the uniform should be treated as a footnote in history. No veteran should be remembered only when it is too late. Reba's story is like a stone thrown into a still lake. Its effects still ripple outward. She inspired change, raised awareness, united strangers around a lost name. But most of all, she gave us a mission, to not allow another Reba to be erased by neglect, because in the end, remembering is an act of justice, and memory, when cultivated with truth, transforms. May Reba Caroline Bailey's story echo in our decisions, in our policies, in our hearts. May she remind us of what it truly means to honor someone, and that, before each flag raised, we can remember someone fought for this and deserves to be remembered. Reba Caroline Bailey. A name that for decades was buried in silence now resounds as a quiet cry for justice. Her story is not just about the recovery of a forgotten identity. It is about a nation awakening to those who, like her, served with honor and were left behind. The funeral at Arlington was not just a country's final tribute. It was the first step in a reckoning with its own historical conscience. Today, Reba's name is etched not only in restored archives, but in the collective memory of a people who are slowly beginning to see what they once ignored. Her journey defies the comforts of formal tributes and forces us to look to the present. Because while we celebrate this belated victory, there are still many living the same absences, many whose names have yet to be spoken, whose stories have yet to be told. May Reba's journey be more than a lesson for us. May it be a legacy, a beacon of light in the darkness of oblivion, a living reminder that true patriotism is not manifested in words alone, but in concrete acts of remembrance, respect, and responsibility. Let us not wait another 60 years to recognize a hero. May justice not arrive when silence has already taken over. And with every flag that waves, every anthem sung, every tribute paid, let us remember, the dignity of a nation is measured by how much it honors its forgotten ones.